We're beginning Chapter 11, Public Access at Drug Agencies. If companies wanted to publish negative studies, they could, but companies don't like to publish negative studies. It's amusing so many people are making pronouncements about the data, scientists and physicians, without seeing the data. Russell Katz, Director of the Neuropharmacology Division at the FDA. If commercial success depends on withholding data that are important to prescribe drugs rationally and safely, there is something fundamentally wrong with our priorities in healthcare. It is of vital importance for public health that doctors and the public can get access to all data generated from all trials in patients and healthy human volunteers, and not just a biased sample, as is currently the case. A good starting point for total access is the data the drug companies have submitted to drug agencies. Chief statistician Hans Melander and his co-workers at the Swedish drug agency have such access, and they showed in 2003 that published trial reports of SSRIs were seriously flawed compared to the study reports submitted in registration applications. In all 42 trials submitted to the agency, but one, the companies had performed both an intention to treat analysis and a per protocol analysis, where dropped out patients are not accounted for. In only 2 of the publications, however, were both analyses presented, whereas in the remainder, only the more favorable per protocol analysis was presented. This created a large misconception about how effective the drugs are. Moreover, separate trials were sometimes published as if they were the same trial. Cross-references to multiple publications of the same trial were missing, and sometimes there were no author names in common in multiple publications of the same trial. In 2008, also of antidepressants confirmed that the published data are seriously flawed compared to data submitted to the FDA. The effect in the published trials was 32% larger than in all trials in FDA's possession, and more than double as large as in unpublished trials. Furthermore, there was spin on the results. 6 trials that were deemed questionable by the FDA were positive when published. And when 8 of 24 negative trials were published, 5 were positive. Another study of 164 trials included in 33 new drug applications also found that what was published didn't reflect what was submitted to the FDA. Drug regulators have used absurd arguments to deny researchers access to unpublished trials and data. They have gone so far as regarding suicides occurring while taking a drug that was supposed to prevent suicide a trade secret. The drug industry's arguments have been equally absurd and exploitative. The drug industry's arguments have been equally absurd and exploitative of patients. The proposal to register all trials so that we know also about the unpublished ones was rejected in 2000 by drug industry representatives, claiming that the very existence of trials was a trade secret. Drummond Rennie, deputy editor of JAMA, wondered why the FDA had been completely absent from the debate over trial registration and why it didn't correct journal results that directly conflicted with what the FDA knew to be true facts, with the excuse that they have no mandate to inform the public. Wrong. The FDA is supposed to do exactly that, to regard the health of the public. Ian Chalmers, the founder of the Cochrane collaboration, considers underreporting of research an equally serious form of scientific misconduct as fabrication of data. I agree, in fact, the consequences for patients are much more devastating, as it is so common. On average, only about half of all studies ever get published. But it can be far worse. A review of dyspepsia caused by 5-old NSAIDs found 15 published placebo-controlled trials and 11 unpublished trials on the FDA's website. Only one trial was both published and submitted by the companies to the FDA, but the authors of the published papers were completely different from the investigators listed in the FDA report. Don't you wonder why any type of scientific misconduct flourishes in healthcare all over the place? If researchers in a single study decided to delete half of their results because they didn't give the results they had hoped for. Oh, I fucked that all up. If the researchers in a single study decided to delete half of their results because they didn't give the results they had hoped for and published the rest, we would call it scientific misconduct. But when whole studies go missing, we accept it as a normal part of life, although it is deeply unethical towards our patients. Selective reporting of results is scientific misconduct, which the Danish Association of the Pharmaceutical Industry has acknowledged. But our institutions have generally failed us. Not a single organization has used its powers, stood up and announced that this must stop, apart from one, the UK Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine, a small organization with about 1,400 members. Our breakthrough at the EMA in 2010. In 2007, PhD student Anders Jorgensen and I decided that the secrecy at drug agencies was so unbearable that we would do everything we could. In 2007, PhD student Anders Jorgensen and I decided that the secrecy at drug agencies was so unbearable that we would do everything we could to get access to unpublished studies at the EMA. We failed, which we expected. We would publish our experiences, particularly arguments from the regulator, to expose to the world how deeply unethical the secrecy was, and we would then continue our fight from there till we succeeded. We chose anti-obesity drugs as our test case because they are so dangerous that most of them have been taken off the market after having caused horrific harms. We asked the EMA for access to the clinical study reports and corresponding trial protocols for Rimonabant and Orlistat, submitted to the agency. We outlined the plans for our research and explained that it was essential that the submitted documents became available for independent researchers because of the likely widespread future of the use of these drugs, the relatively small effect on overweight in published reports, in the serious safety concerns that had been raised. In fact, Rimonabant was withdrawn from the European market in the middle of the process when independent studies found that adverse effects, including severe depression and increased risk of suicide, was more serious and common and then showed by the manufacturer Sanofi Adventis in their clinical studies. We argued that secrecy isn't in the best interest of the patients because biased reporting of drug trials is common, and also noted that we hadn't found any information that could comprise commercial interests in 44 trial protocols of industry-initiated trials we had reviewed previously. Although the EMA's primary aim is to protect the public, the EMA replied, without any comment in our arguments, that the documents could not be released because it would undermine commercial interests. We appealed to the EMA's executive director, Thomas Longren, and asked him to explain why the agency considered that the commercial interests of the drug industry should override the welfare of patients. We argued with convincing real-life examples that a likely consequence of EMA's position was that patients would die unnecessarily and would be treated with inferior and potentially harmful drugs. Their doctors didn't know what their true benefits and harms were. Longren sent us a similar cut-and-paste type letter to the first one, ignoring our request for clarification, and told us we could lodge a complaint with the European Ombudsman M. Nikephoros Dimiandros, which we did. It took 3 years before our case was settled. We described it in the BMJ and posted the 27 documents that circulated between the Ombudsman and the EMA and us, and a comprehensive report of the case on our website, the Cochrane DK/research/EMA. To avoid disclosing the documents, the EMA put forward 4 main arguments: protection of commercial interests, no overriding public interess, the administrative burden involved, and the worthlessness of the data to us after the EMA had redacted them. I'm sure Longren felt the armor he had built up was impenetrable, but he had not calculated with the Ombudsman, who rejected all his arguments. He stated that commercial interests might be at stake, but that the risk of an interest being undermined must be reasonably foreseeable and not purely hypothetical. He could not see that the access would specifically and actually undermine commercial interests. After having inspected the relevant reports and protocols at the EMA in London, he concluded that the documents didn't contain commercially confidential information. The Ombudsman indicated that we had established an overriding public interest, but noted that this question needed answering only if disclosure undermined commercial interests. He asked the EMA to justify its position that there wasn't an overriding public interest, but Longren avoided replying by saying that we had not given we had not given evidence of the existence of such an interest. We surely had, and in addition, the argument was irrelevant. A suspect asked for his alibi on the day of the crime doesn't get off the hook by asking for someone else's alibi. About the administrative burden and the usefulness of the documents after the EMA had redacted them, the Ombudsman noted that the request documents didn't identify patients by name, but by their identification and test center numbers, and he concluded that the only personal data were those identifying the study authors and principal investigators, and to redact this information would be quick and easy. When we received the documents, nothing was redacted. Since the EMA continued to be completely resistant to our arguments and those from the Ombudsman, in the most shameless, arrogant fashion, he played his final card. 3 years after our request, he accused the EMA of maladministration in the press release. This had the effect that the agency reversed its stance completely. It now gave the impression that it had favored disclosure all the time, agreed with the Ombudsman's reasoning, and noted that the same principle would be applied for future requests for access. This is how drug companies operate. They fight forcefully against openness. But when there is no escape, they pretend they have been in favor of it all the time. They usually go one step further, as they give the impression that it was their own idea to begin with. Obviously, it isn't possible to protect the profits of the drug companies and the lives and welfare of the patients at the same time. One has to choose, and our case illustrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that the EMA sided with the drug industry and put profits over patients. Moreover, the position wasn't even consistent when we also pointed out in our letters. It denied access to trial data on adult patients while providing access to data on pediatric trials, which it had to do because of EU legislation. I felt it was an aggravating fact, which we also pointed out in our letters, that the EMA had helped the drug industry to get away with violating the Declaration of Helsinki, which states that the researchers have a duty to make publicly available the results of their research on humans. We also noted that by violating these universal human rights, the EMA was complicit in the exploitation of patients for commercial gains, as the patients are used as a means to an end and treated suboptimally as well, which are both unacceptable. Furthermore, we drew attention to the declaration statement: medical research involving human subjects must be based on a thorough knowledge of scientific literature, and argued that if the knowledge base is incomplete, patients may suffer and cannot give fully informed consent. Thus, by being secretive, the EMA also acquiesced to unethical research in future. Worst of all, it didn't bother the EMA that it contributed to the unfortunate situation that doctors and patients were unable to select those treatments that provide the best balance between benefits, harms, and cost, as they were denied access to the evidence. It didn't bother either that tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths could have been avoided each year if the public had access to the unpublished information. Our case was a major breakthrough for public health. In November 2010, the EMA declared it would widen public access to documents, including trial reports and protocols, but it shouldn't have been so difficult to get there, given the fundamental principles on which the European Union is based. Any citizen of the Union and any natural or legal person residing or having its registered office in a member state has a right of access to documents of the institutions, subject to principles, conditions, and limits defined in this regulation. Openness enables citizens to participate more closely in the decision-making process and guarantees that the administration enjoys greater legitimacy and is more effective and more accountable to the citizen in a democratic system. Openness contributes to strengthening the principles of democracy and respect for fundamental rights as laid down in Article 6 of the EU Treaty and in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Longren made sure my PhD student was unable to do the work we had planned. After his efforts at protecting the industry's commercial interests, he quit the EMA, also in a shameless fashion. Although Longren had been told by the EMA that he should not provide product-related advice to drug companies or take managerial, executive, or consultative positions in the industry for a period of 2 years, because he became director of a new company, Pharma Executive Consulting Ltd., in November 2010 while still employed by the EMA. A year later, the EMA held a workshop at its headquarters that made history. Its new head, Guido Rassi, started by announcing that we are not here to decide if we will publish clinical trial clinical trial data. Only how? The industry representatives were stunned. Their usual arguments for secrecy were torn into pieces during the discussions, and the head of the UK regulator, Kent Woods, looked like a thing from the past when he tried to argue that there wasn't really a need for the EMA's new openness and transparency. I have never before seen the mighty drug industry lose a public battle so completely as during this afternoon. There, in a video in 2 parts on the EMA's website that takes up 3.5 hours in total, but it's really worth seeing. There had been another case before ours, Liam's Grant, father of a boy who committed suicide while on the acne drug isotretinoin, Roaccutane, from Roche, and tried to find out which harms the company had informed the authorities about before marketing approval. The EMA granted access to the reported harms in 2010. In 2002, Danish journals had also tried to get access to reported adverse events on Roaccutane. The so-called Periodic Safety Update Reports, PSUR, from the Danish Medical Agency. The agency was willing to give access, but Roche blocked this by arguing it would create a substantial risk for considerable losses for Roche. Roche even threatened to sue the Danish state if disclosure harmed the company's commercial interests. Sue a state because fewer patients will take a drug after they found it might kill them? How absurd can healthcare get? This is how gangsters operate. If you do anything that will harm our sales of heroin, we'll come after you. The comparison is appropriate, as Roche built its fortune on massive profits from illegal sales of heroin and morphine. The fact that Roche regards the harms reported by patients or their relatives as the company's private property demonstrates such an outrageous disrespect for patients and human lives, particularly in this case where the drug had been associated with severe depression and suicide, that I'm speechless. Access to data at other drug agencies. In 2010, we contacted Chief Statistician Hans Melander at the Swedish Drug Agency and asked for access to the placebo-controlled trials and protocols for 3 SSRIs, citalopram, escitalopram, and venlafaxine, submitted to the agency. We could get everything we wanted, but there was a problem. The reports had been filed in a mountain cave somewhere in Sweden where they took up 70 meters. It would cost about 50,000 euros to retrieve all this and move it back to the agency in Uppsala. But the agency generously offered to cover this cost. We could then work with the material at the agency or have it all copied for 13 euro cents per page, or copy it ourselves at no cost and take it to Denmark. I estimated that 70 meters in binders was about 500,000 pages, or around 70,000 euros to get the material copied. In order to work with all this, we needed to scan it using special software that could also handle tables and convert it to searchable text. I told Melander to hold the horses and wait. I told Melander to hold the horses and wait while we worked on our pilot study of duloxetine. Duloxetine. Over more than a year, we had received documents from the EMA, also on other SSRIs, and they were still coming in. These documents were PDF files, which we converted to searchable text. But even so, it took two of our researchers more than a year before they had extracted the data we needed. The Dutch regulator was also very forthcoming, but they redacted the adverse effects before they sent us the files, which they were obligated to do according to a court verdict, so the material wasn't very useful. In 1993, a bill was put before the British Parliament that would lead to greater access to regulatory information about the efficacy and safety of drugs. But it was immediately shut down by the industry, aided by its apologists in government. Ironically, in the same year as the government published its white paper on open government. Contacting the UK regulator to get data on fluoxetine, which the EMA didn't have, was like contacting the MI5. The reply we got was anonymous, and we were told that the agency had destroyed the files. The Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, destroys the files after 15 years unless there is a legal, regulatory, or business need to keep them, or unless they are considered to be of lasting historic interest. No legal or historic interest for unpublished drug trials for drugs that are still on the market? Can the irony be deeper than this? There were also bureaucratic obstacles. Each individual document should be requested through a separate request and will be reviewed and assessed in terms of its suitability for release. We limited our request to very little, which the agency had told us was in their possession, but were then told that public authorities are not required to comply with requests that they judge to constitute an excessive use of their resources. The time taken to complete the FOI, Freedom of Information request, should take no time longer than 24 working hours, otherwise it is deemed an excessive use of resource. Your request falls into this category. Undeterred by this, I wrote that members of the European Commission and Parliament had been shocked when I told them that the MHRA destroys its files after 15 years. I suggested that since the UK was the EU reference member state of fluoxetine and only the marketing authorization holder, Eli Lilly, had the files, the agency should ask Lilly to submit the files to the agency, as companies are obliged by law to retain them. Finally, I noted that based on our collaboration with other drug agencies what we had requested couldn't come anywhere near 24 hours. And I reminded the MHRA about the basic principles about citizens' access to EU documents and that the UK was in fact a member state in the EU. New obstacles appeared from my preliminary assessment of your request. I will not be able to answer it within 20 days specified in the Act. It is my initial view that Section 43, Commercial Interests, of the Act may apply to at least some of the information you have requested. Oh boy. This message came a year after the Ombudsman's press release accusing the EMA of maladministration and saying there were no commercial interests to protect. In the next letter, the MHRA said that it had consulted with Lilly, which had to release the documents to us, as such release would harm the company. How could they know? Did they cover up something? Very likely they did. It changed tactics and asked whether the MHRA had thought about what its attitude might mean for its image, and complained that the MHRA hadn't realized that it needed to update its policies and routines and bring them at part with the recent openness at the EMA. It worked. After 3 additional months and 7 months after our initial request, the MHRA informed us that they would send us the documents, but the MHRA was still the lapdog of Big Pharma. Please bear in mind that the volume of information you have asked us for is large and has taken time to redact and to liaise with the marketing authorization holder to ensure they were fully informed of what we were intending to release to you. A good thing was that, in contrast to the files we received from the Dutch agency's adverse effects had not been redacted. Only signatures, names, addresses, investigators, CVs, ethics committee information, and consent forms were redacted. Why weren't we allowed to see the bits about ethics? Was Lilly afraid we might find out that some of their trials were unethical? We already know that consent forms routinely lie to patients as they are told they contribute to science, when in reality many studies are shelved. It doesn't make sense to delete this information as it isn't commercially confidential information, but it illustrates how arbitrary regulatory decisions are. The FDA isn't forthcoming. Requests for data need to be very specific, which is difficult when you don't know what is available. And researchers on its website to find information may turn up hundreds of documents that are not clearly named, not indexed, don't have a page title, and which exist only as non-searchable scanned images. The documents may not tell you what they are about until you get to page 19. That results in many people giving up, as we did when we tried. Furthermore, data are missing or arbitrarily deleted. For example, only 16 out of at least 27 trials of Celoxib, Celebrex, were included in any FDA reports requested by researchers according to the Freedom of Information Act. Independent researchers who had access to FDA data nevertheless confirmed the cardiovascular harms of the drug. For another COX-2 inhibitor, Veledcoxib Bextra from Celare, 28 consecutive pages had been deleted by the FDA before they were sent to independent researchers, as they had contained trade secrets and/or confidential information that is not disclosable. This is totally absurd, as these pages came from the FDA's statistical review and evaluation of Veledcoxib. There are absolutely no trade secrets or confidential information that is not disclosable in such reports. Deadly slimming pills. The history of the slimming pills is a dire one that confirms that drug regulators aren't willing to learn from history. Phentermine was approved in the United States in 1959 and is still on the market, although it's similar to amphetamine, both chemically and in its effects. In the 1960s, another appetite suppressant with amphetamine effects, aminorex, was very popular in Europe, but it causes pulmonary hypertension and was withdrawn after 7 years when hundreds of patients had died under terrible conditions. In 1973, flenfluramine podamine. Yet another amphetamine-like drug was introduced on the U.S. market. It increases the neurotransmitter serotonin, which the SSRIs also do. The drug was withdrawn in 1997 as it causes pulmonary hypertension and a serious form of fibrosis of the heart valves that also kills people. Podmonin was close to never making it to the market, but the FDA scientist who had written a disapproval letter was removed to another job. This led to a congressional investigation of misconduct at the FDA that concluded that a leading FDA officer had misled Congress. This officer left the FDA to become an expert witness for drug companies. Of course he did. History surely repeats itself in drug regulation. In the 1990s, many scientific articles in Europe described podmonin's detrimental effects, but Wyeth, the maker of the drug, didn't send these reports to the FDA. An obvious reason why Wyeth didn't draw attention to the dangers with podmonin was that the company was trying to get approval for a similarly deadly drug, dexfenfluramine Redux, which was simply the D-enantiomer of fenfluramine that consists of two enantiomers, which are mirror images of each other. A researcher who had worked with the drug while being employed by Servier went privately to the FDA with his findings that fenfluramine and dexfenfluramine led to brain damage in apes and baboons, but he was immediately fired and nothing happened that might have protected the patients. Everything goes on in drug regulation, and dexfenfluramine came on the market in Europe. However, its use was severely restricted in 1995 after French researchers had shown that both podmonin and Redux increased the risk of pulmonary hypertension 10 times. These findings were arrogantly dismissed by the FDA, and the industry complained over a critical FDA officer. Nonetheless, the FDA Advisory Committee rejected the drug because of safety concerns. Wyeth complained, and a new meeting was held just 2 months later, which is highly unusual. The committee now included more Redux supporters, and the drug was narrowly approved in November 1995, with the votes 6-5. When numbers of cases with pulmonary hypertension increased rapidly, FDA doctors tried to convince Wyeth Interneuron that they should add a black box warning on the label. Instead, they graciously added a notice that Redux could cause hair loss, which had been reported more rarely than pulmonary hypertension. This story of unbelievable crimes toward the patients was continued 4 months after approval of Redux. The damning French results were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but with an editorial that praised the drug and said that the risk of pulmonary hypertension was small and outweighed by the benefits of the drug. There wasn't a trace in the editorial that its 2 authors were paid by the industry, which fact infuriated the editors of the journal when it was revealed by the Wall Street Journal. The benefit was a mere 3% weight loss, as stated by the company, for example, from 100 kilograms to 97 kilograms. However, many patients dropped out of the trial, and conventional statistical adjustment for this is flawed. Companies used the last recorded weight and carry it forward till the end of the trial. However, much of the weight people lose in the beginning comes back later. And even more important, if people cannot tolerate a drug, they cannot benefit from it. It would therefore be more sensible to carry forward the weight at baseline. In one of our studies of Rimion, the last observation carried forward showed a weight loss of 6.4 kilograms above placebo, while baseline carried forward showed a benefit of only 1.5 kilograms. While the patients continued to die because of the slimming pills they took, the academic researcher Mike Weintraub touted treatment with a combination of two amphetamine-like products, fenfluramine, podmonin, and the old drug fentyramine, on TV programs and elsewhere. Although this off-label use had not been approved by the FDA, the combination pill was called fen. It became extremely popular, even though an article flagged problems with memory loss in 1996. The total number of prescriptions exceeded 18 million. However, in the summer of 1997, a series of 24 women who have developed valve disease while on fen was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, accompanied by an editorial written by the editor that this time left no doubt that the drugs are dangerous. Based on that paper, the FDA pressed Wyeth Interneuron to withdraw Redux and Podmonin from the market. But Wyeth didn't give up. It had plans for neutralizing critical doctors, and its doubt industry came into gear. Hired guns among physicians lent their names to flawed results, and specialist journals lent their pages to the dirty work above the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Although the cardiologists should have been the most concerned doctors because the patients died from diseases in their specialty, one such cardiologist, Neil Weissman, published a paper in this journal in 1999, and similar papers in the other journals purporting there was no problem. He received a total of almost $18 million from Wyeth for his studies. Richard Atkinson, the president of the American Obesity Association, which received money from Wyeth Interneuron, strongly defended the drugs and aired that the study in the New England Journal of Medicine was inadequate. The American College of Cardiology issued a press release declaring that the heart problems disappeared once patients stopped taking the pills. This was a blatant lie. Hired moles asked their colleagues for the medical data that had showed valve disease without revealing they were sent by Wyeth, in one case indicating they worked for the FDA. The company had also launched campaigns trivializing the harms in a hope of getting the drugs back on the market. A famous obesity specialist, George Blackburn, gave many pep talks, but filed a sworn affidavit in Boston's court that he had not given talks and had not received any money from the companies. When confronted with his lies and whereabouts, he didn't remember anything. Wyeth could have warned the public years before independent researchers found out about the harms. Another big company, American Home Products, which marketed Podmonin, behaved similarly badly. It had 160 cases of pulmonary hypertension buried in-house while patients were still being prescribed Podmonin. Starting in April 1996, American Home Products even circulated an internal monthly memo called the Podmonin Monthly Death List. The company obstructed justice by destroying thousands of documents and emails after an order was issued by court not to do this. American Home Products denied it had done anything wrong, denied it had known earlier that its drugs might be dangerous, and said that we never even promoted Podmonin. The only thing that is missing in this soap opera is a denial that the dead patients had ever existed. Perhaps even the company didn't exist, but was just a figment of our imagination in line with a social constructivism? When the plaintiff's lawyers got access to Wyeth's archives, they had close to 3 million pages copied into computers so that they became searchable. This was an amazing feat. If we stack so many pages, the height of the stack will be about 300 meters. The lawyers found 101 reports of pulmonary hypertension and more than 50 cases of valve disease, which Wyeth had marketed as something else. After the FDA had refused to approve Redux at its first meeting, Wyeth sent a document to a different bureau in the FDA, where 52 cases of pulmonary hypertension were well hidden on a little graph in a 40-page document. This Wyeth had the nerve to call disclosure. B. An FDA investigation at Wyeth's headquarters uncovered that Wyeth's safety officer had written over the first 13 reports of valve disease the company had received from the Mayo Clinic about fen-phen and used the same log numbers for other drugs and less serious adverse effects. However, instead of a criminal investigation, the FDA wrote to Wyeth that its reporting system failed to assure that all reports are accurate. This was, to put it mildly, but Wyeth's lawyers protested, and a second FDA letter was apologetic about the first letter and politely urged Wyeth to clean up its act. I wonder what kind of society we would have if this was how the police was supposed to address a murderer. Dear little thing, we would be so happy if you wouldn't do it again. Please accept our profuse apologies that one of our officers accused you of murder, and have a nice day. There were other revelations when the FDA officer had threatened Wyeth that if they didn't warn the physician about neurotoxicity, the FDA would. Wyeth went to the top. Wyeth went to the top at the FDA, and no warning letter was ever sent. It seems that the top of the FDA is capable of almost anything that benefits the drug companies. In 1994, the FDA decided at a meeting that a black box warning was needed for Ponmonin, telling about 50 cases of pulmonary hypertension, but the addendum to the minutes said that nothing would be done anyhow, without any explanation. An FDA scientist produced a report in 1999 that showed exactly what information the companies had given the FDA about valve disease and when. The FDA lawyers made sure the FDA could not be incriminated by locking it away in a drawer. As for reports of adverse events, the FDA had left it to the companies to decide themselves whether an event was serious and what to mention first, which had the effect that many cases of reported valve problems were overlooked by the seriously understaffed FDA safety division as they weren't mentioned on the first page. During court proceedings, 52 cases of left valvular disease, which cannot be caused by pulmonary hypertension, as this affects the right valves, were discussed, and none of them had been coded as valvular disease. The company had also deceived the FDA originally about its animal studies. The valves of rats' hearts had thickened dramatically and stiffened, but this was hidden under the rather innocent term focal fibrosis, which was camouflage for the real thing. What the company told the FDA was only the good news. The rats didn't develop cancer. Marianne Finkel, the FDA official who had originally approved Podmonin, but now consulted the drug companies, tried her best to put her client in good light. Pulmonary hypertension is a terrible disease, and symptoms can start already after a week on the drug. It's uniformly fatal, with a mean survival less than many cancers, and the symptoms feel like strangulation or drowning. The valve disease is similarly devastating. At the time of the mass tort lawsuits, an estimated 45,000 women were believed to have developed one or both of the two diseases, with an expected death toll of the same size. These drugs were superseded by sibutramine in 2001, which not only increases serotonin in the brain, but also neuroepinephrine and dopamine. It came as no surprise when it was removed from the market in 2010 because of cardiovascular harms. In 2007, we asked for access to the unpublished trials with this drug at the Danish Drug Agency, which it was granted a year later, but the lawyers of the company, Abbott, blocked the permission for another year by lodging a complaint with the Danish Ministry of Health. Using our Freedom of Information Act, we found that a hired gun cardiologist, Christian Torp Pedersen, had signed the letter from Abbott to the ministry, which undoubtedly gave it more credibility. We felt that the cardiologist should have worried more about his patients and the cardiovascular harms of sibutramine than about the company's health. Why on earth are such drugs still being approved given their history? And why was Benfluorex, mediator from Civier, which is structurally related to phenethylamine and has similar harms, not taken off the European market until 2009 when Podmonin disappeared in 1997? Well, there is nothing new under the sun. There were conflicts of interest among expert advisors and also institutionalized cooperation with the drug industry, and the much hyped and lauded public-private partnership, PPP. Unhealthy ties between the regulator and the industry were also uncovered, and there were suspicions that Civier, which is a French company, had obtained far too much political influence. The head of the French drug agency resigned because of the scandal. Slimming pills are poor drugs that are not liked by the patients. In drug trials, doctors have financial incentives for keeping patients on the drug, but in real life, the situation is very different. A study showed that after just 1 year, less than 10% of the patients still took their drugs. Sibutramine or orlistat, a drug that decreased fat absorption, and after 2 years it was less than 2%. Recent decisions underlie that the drug agencies refuse to learn from history. FDA staff explained in 2012 why the FDA had approved 2 new slimming pills, Belviq, Lorcesterine, Area Pharmaceuticals, and Qsimia, Phentermine plus topiramate, Vivius. Lorastatin increases serotonin, increases the incidence of multiple tumors and valvulopathy in rats, and increases Lorastatin increases serotonin, increases the incidence of multiple tumors and valvulopathy in rats, and increases valvulopathy in 16% of patients. Topiram, topimerate, topimerate may increase the risk of orofacial cleft if taken during pregnancy, which is a problem the FDA solved with a fake fix we know won't work. Tell the women to protect themselves against pregnancy. Both drugs may create psychiatric disturbances and other important adverse effects. And the FDA required a rigorous assessment of long-term cardiovascular safety for the drugs. Although it doesn't and cannot enforce such demands, another fake fix. We will surely see new slimming pill scandals. Obesity specialists have defended the slimming pills all along by saying that the increased risk of dying caused by the drugs is counteracted by the fact that even a minor weight loss in a large population leads to more lives saved than lost. This is a poor argument. First, it hasn't been shown to be true. Second, even if it were true, there is a huge difference between being slowly killed by a drug under terrible suffering and a benefit at a population level. It's a fact of life that we may die sooner if we have unhealthy lifestyles. We all know this. If we want to reduce the number of people dying from obesity, we should first and foremost tackle the food industry. Giving people drugs is a fake fix that is very dangerous. In 2008, a 2008 study of 5,743 users of fenfluramine showed that the prevalence of mild aortic regurgitation of moderate mitral regurgitation or worse was 20% in women and 12% in men. The risk increased markedly with months of use, and valve surgery was performed in 1 of 200 patients with drug-induced valvulopathy, and yet the FDA has now approved a similar drug. Mighty chapter. And that's it for that chapter 11. You're on an epilepsy drug for everything. And they gave that shit to me too, huh? Glad I don't take it.